All right. Okay, so thanks for having me. So I'll try to be on time. I've been said to go fast. So when I've seen the list from Marco actually about the presentation I was supposed to deliver, I realized there were a bunch of things I could not mention actually. So to avoid doing like a 3-slide presentation, actually, I'll talk about BlaBlaCar as in the context of the disruption we create and in the context of positive disruption. So before I talk about that, I mean, let me just go through what's BlaBlaCar and what we do for people who don't know. So BlaBlaCar is pretty much a very simple service. It's a city-to-city ride-sharing service. And the way it works is pretty basic. As a driver, let's say if you happen to drive between Berlin and Munich this weekend, you would go on BlaBlaCar and you would offer these empty seats you have in your car to passengers going the same way. And as a passenger, you go on BlaBlaCar very much, you would go on any travel website, you look at trips between Berlin and Munich, and you end up booking those seats in these empty seats in these cars. So essentially, we're creating this community of people sharing rides between cities all over Europe and now beyond Europe. So there are a few things I wanted to mention, like a few fundamental things about what we do and about the paradigm we created. The first thing is that in our community, the drivers are driving anyway. So essentially, the whole concept is that we're not actually putting cars on the road. The whole concept is that a driver that drives anyway between those two cities is going to offer his or her empty seats in the car. And the other fundamental paradigm of BlaBlaCar is that those drivers actually don't make a profit, right? So we've built the community and we've built the marketplace in such a way that the drivers are going to offset their cost of driving between those two cities, and passengers are going to contribute toward that cost. And by doing that, essentially, you end up with essentially no little regulation issues. You end up with no tax issue because the driver does not make a profit. And in a way, you also end up with no insurance issue because you're in a cost-sharing activity. So by doing that, we also created a very low-cost transport network because doing this cost-sharing activity, you end up offering very, very low prices between cities in Europe. So for example, it would be 20 euro between Paris and Brussels. It would be 15 to 20 euro between Berlin and Hamburg. So we end up creating this very low-cost transport network. Now, all of that, even though it's a travel service, all of that at the end of the day is actually powered by a community. So if I think of what we do every day and the key focus of the company today in 19 countries is actually creating trust and creating a reputation within a community. So even though externally we talk about passengers, we talk about people traveling through the BlaBlaCar network, internally we talk about reputation, we talk about peer reviews, and how do we foster trust in that community. So it's all based on this concept of trusted community. And obviously all of that matters because today we're doing that at a massive scale. So that community of trusted profile is over 20 million members, and 20 million members not just in Europe, even though we're pretty much in every major market in Europe, but today we're in 19 countries. So we are in France, Germany, UK, Spain, Italy, Poland, I mean most major markets in Europe. But in the last year, we also expanded into Russia, Turkey, Mexico, and India. And the goal is obviously to expand the network on a global scale. And essentially today, we've seen that this core activity or the basic need we fulfill, which is the need of traveling cheaply between cities, is actually pretty universal. So wherever you have people wanting to travel cheaply between cities, and wherever you have cars and people driving cars with empty seats, we found that it tends to work. With some adaptation, but globally it tends to work. So just a quick snapshot on the growth of the company. So essentially we went through maybe 2 transformations as a company. 3 years ago, it was very much a French company. The service was pretty much only in France, and you can see here the new members, the people joining the community, were essentially only in that market. And over time, we went from being a French company to very much being a European company, having offices all over Europe, having made acquisition all over Europe. And in the last year, we became more of a global company. Today, having growth in markets like India, Russia, Latin America, and maybe more countries in the future. So today we add probably over 1 million members every month actually to the BlaBlaCar community, with France still growing pretty massively. Obviously, we've done that with some funding. So going through very quickly the history, the funding history of the company, we first raised from a French fund called Isaïe, which were the first believers actually in the model back in 2010, which was back then actually far from obvious because people thought of what we were doing as hitchhiking online, which is not a big market. And then people came to realize actually we disrupting this more global transport network, and it's not about like people hitchhiking like back in the 70s. It's actually about people traveling low cost between cities, which is a huge segment. So Isaïe came in 2010. Axel came in 2011 at the beginning of the European transformation when we thought, okay, now we need to tackle Europe as a market as opposed to just France. And we started to acquire companies across Europe. We started to set up teams in every country in Europe. And I would say in 2014, we kind of ended up where we were in 2011, thinking, okay, now we've done a decent job in Europe, and the service is at scale in most major markets in Europe, and we need to go global. So we went on and raised last year $100 million from Index Ventures, who led the round, but also LeadEdge, Axel, and Isaïe actually contributed to that round. And the key of that round was bringing BlaBlaCar to a global scale, which in the last 9 months we've been doing by opening, as I said, Russia, Mexico, India, and Turkey. So last but not least, I touched on that point, but we've done our expansion by a mix of setting up teams in different countries. So today we have 12 offices across the globe and 300 employees. But we've also done that by acquisition. So we acquired 7 companies actually in the last 3 years to expand in different markets. One of the latest actually acquisition or merger was with carpooling.com in Germany, which was like the biggest German ride-sharing site actually in Germany called Mitfahrgelegenheit or Mitfahrzentrale. So today we essentially end up being #1 in every market in Europe and really focusing on global expansion. So going back to my initial statement about positive disruption, I'll go quickly through like a macro statement, which is, can we still afford empty seats in cars? And if you think of Europe and the US, maybe we can. It's maybe not great, but maybe we can. But if you take that at a global scale, it really doesn't make sense. I mean, if you think of traffic in India or in China today, within a few years it went from bad to terrible, and it's just going to be worse and worse. So if you think of like traffic, if you think of pollution, it's getting pretty absurd to think of the number of cars we're adding on the road and the very low car occupancy. So one of the key misconceptions when we describe the market for BlaBlaCar is that most people think that whether it's in Europe or anywhere in the world, most people think that people travel by train or by bus most of the time between cities. In fact, if you look at any market in Europe, if you look at Europe as as an aggregated market, 75 or 76, in fact, % of the city-to-city travel is done by car. And what people actually didn't realize initially, what we're disrupting more than trains and buses actually is the use of the car, right? Because our drivers actually come from that 76%, and even to some extent, a large portion of our passengers come from that 76% share of the pie. So we're disrupting a much larger market than trains and buses. We're disrupting the entire, or changing behavior in the entire mobility scale. So for the sake of time, I'll go pretty quickly, but essentially the key argument is car occupancy, right? So we increase car occupancy compared to an average of 1.7 in Europe to 2.8. And if you think of that at scale, essentially you take long-term, you take cars off the road because you have a better car occupancy between cities all across Europe. So I'll finish on 2 figures, actually on 1 slide and 2 figures. One is obviously that argument matters if it goes at scale, right? So if it was a small service used by 100,000 people per country, it would be irrelevant. But today, if you look at the number of travelers actually using BlaBlaCar, either as driver or passenger, on a quarterly basis, we end up with very fast growth, but very significant numbers, right? So today we're talking about 10 million travelers every quarter using BlaBlaCar to travel between cities. And we get to a scale where it's clearly changing the mobility landscape in Europe, and I hope in the next few years it's going to change that on a more global scale. So 2 quick numbers to finish that presentation. Today we already know, if we just look at the passengers, so people actually booking seats in other people's car, Today, we already know that 28% of these passengers would either not have traveled or would have taken their own car. And that number is increasing very rapidly, and I explain why. So first of all, we create mobility, right? So it's very interesting because you end up enabling people to travel either because you create a lower cost service or because you end up connecting cities that were not connected before, right? So we have this very agile transport network. And number two, we take actually drivers off the road over time. So there is an education process when in fact we realize that our passengers are actually all drivers in a way. So what you see here is actually what we call like a cross-usage cohort. But what we look at is how the driver behavior is changing over time. And what's fascinating to see is, if you start BlaBlaCar as a driver, sharing your 2 or 3 empty seats in your car on year one, in fact, you have over 60% chance to develop a passenger behavior, right? So today, we're not really thinking of drivers and passengers in the community. We're thinking of travelers, knowing that at the end of the day, people will use both sides of the marketplace. And long term, you end up taking cars off the road. So with that, I'm seriously timed out. So thank you. I'll probably skip the last slide. So thanks for your time. Thanks.